All right, good afternoon. It's 12 o'clock. It's time for our weekly Iowa Learning Farms webinar. I'm Matt Helmers with Iowa State University Extension and Outreach and Iowa Nutrient Research Center, and also a faculty affiliate with Iowa Learning Farms. Uh, just as a reminder, Iowa Learning Farms celebrating 20 years. In fact, tonight we're having a 20-year celebration. So excited that we've made it this far. And one of the great things I get to do is to get to help moderate these webinars. They're really made possible by Elena Whitaker, organizing, and many others that are involved with getting speakers. I'll just put out a plug. If you have someone you think would be good to hear from as part of the Learning Farms webinar series, feel free to send us a note, and we'll definitely consider that and try to get in touch. In fact, that's kind of how we got our speaker today, that one of our attendees said, I think it would be great to have Dr. Andrew Margenot from University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign, talk about some of his work looking at overlooked non-point and non-ag sources of nutrient loss, the case of streambank erosion. We have, there's always been a lot of discussion about streambank erosion, and so I think it's important for us to hear about this work about that component of nutrient loss to streams in our various Midwestern states. And I kind of got to see maybe some of this a couple weeks ago, and I think people will find it really interesting. So as always, if you have questions, feel free to type those in the chat box, and we'll get those to Andrew at the end of his talk. With that, the virtual floor is all yours.
Thank you, Matt. I appreciate the introduction, and thanks to Alina for the help and putting this together, and to Dr. Helmers for the invitation to be here. So, my name is Andrew Margenot. I'm a soil scientist, and you might be wondering, what is a soil scientist doing here talking about stream bank erosion? Aren't streams water? And you would be correct. My basic pitch here is that streams are the interface of terrestrial, so soils, and aquatic, so streams and lakes and rivers. And so there's a lot of need, I think, to integrate soil science with hydrology sciences to understand what I would contend is a overlooked non-point source of nutrient losses that is not an agricultural source. And I'm defining an ag source here as erosion of sediments from within the field and/or manure and fertilizer nutrients. In that sense, stream bank erosion is decidedly a non-point and non-agricultural source. And if you take away one thing from today, that would be that we've done a poor job in the Midwest of quantifying this. To be fair, it's very difficult to quantify, but importantly for policy and for outcomes that we all care about of improving water quality from state to region, we need to get a better handle on how much of our phosphorus in particular, but also sediments, is coming from this process of sloughing off of eroding stream banks. So that's my pitch for today. Okay, so first, thank you to the funders of this work that you're about to hear. This is a coalition of support groups from IFB, our State Farm Bureau, to our NREC, to U.S. Soybean Board, and the National Corn Growers. They've all been very instrumental, and just critical for providing financial and non-financial support and resources for this kind of research. Okay, so I want to begin by laying out where we sit. So if you are in Iowa or in most of Illinois, chances are you are in the upper Mississippi River Basin. This is a subregion of the Mississippi River Basin. This is the largest watershed in North America. It's where we produce the majority of grain in this country. And this region, specifically the I-states, Iowa, Indiana, and Illinois, we produce roughly a third of global corn and global soybean production. So a critical area of the US and of the world when it comes to this grain production. At the same time, we know that we have nutrient losses in the same region. And we care about this because it compromises local quality of waters, but also regional, like the Gulf of Mexico. I think we all know this, so I won't spend too much time on the background. I do, though, want to give you a sense of magnitudes because I'm going to paint for you a story of the apparent phosphorus paradox and why this apparent paradox might be reconciled or harmonized. There is no paradox, it's a bad explanation, by considering things like streambank erosion as a non-point source of phosphorus loss. So this map that you see here in front of you is a map where darker color indicates higher phosphorus loading. This is taking into account both point sources like wastewater treatment plants and non-point sources that include but are not the same as agriculture. There's non-ag non-point sources. And as you can make out, in the upper MRB, where our two states are located, we're losing roughly double the amount of phosphorus as the average across the entire MRB. This makes sense. The entire MRB drains as far west as Wyoming and Montana. Technically, they're in the basin, but as we know, there's not many P losses because there's not that much agriculture or rainfall in those states. So the MRB, specifically the upper MRB, is the subject of a lot of research on where are the nutrients coming from. This is also the most productive swath of the MRB, known as the Corn Belt, the upper Corn Belt more specifically. So we see that this region is the highest contributor of P losses. Iowa and Illinois are ranked number 1 and 2. Depends on the year who's number 1 for phosphorus losses. I know that we have a friendly competition between our states when it comes to football, but also corn yields. I don't think that we want to be competing on who's the worst loser of phosphorus to surface waters. So this is how things stand. But at the same time, I want to point out that we are one of the most efficient users of phosphorus inputs, manure, and fertilizer in the entire union. So this is a county level map of P use efficiency, PUE, and the calculation is a bit coarse. It's the best data we have that is collected by states and by USDA. It's a decent metric, though, of relative efficiencies in how well are we using the fertilizer, phosphorus, or manure for crop production. And if you look at this map, as you can see, the upper MRB, that is the biggest loser of phosphorus, is also the most efficient part of the USA when it comes to using what we're adding. And for context, the global PUE is thought to be 16%. We're at 60 or 80% PUE efficiency. So we're doing pretty good, right? We're 4 to 5 times higher than the global average, and we're definitely higher than the US average in our states. This then might present what we could think of as a phosphorus paradox. How can it be that we're the relatively most efficient area of the US and the world and how well we use our P inputs for crop production, but also we're the biggest offenders when it comes to losing phosphorus to surface waters? This seems like a contradiction. You might imagine higher PUE, being more efficient in how we use it, would mean lower losses. And there are no paradoxes. I am firmly convinced there's just really bad explanation. Something is not right in how we think about this. So to reconcile this paradox, I'd like to have you consider that there's a difference in magnitudes of what matters for crop production versus for water quality. So to illustrate this, let's look at a different map. It's the same basic idea. Now the coloration is from yellow to black. Black means more P losses. And we're now looking at the watershed Huck 8 scale. This is not county scale. But the trends are similar. The upper MRB, including our two states, are the worst offenders, or let's say contributors, the highest contributors of P to the Gulf of Mexico. Now, if we translate these units from kilo per kilometer, it's a geological approach, into an agronomic 1 pound per acre, we can make out that to be a hotspot phosphorus loss watershed, like the one here that I live in right now, that is only quote unquote 1.8 pounds of P per acre. And if you consider that a typical application in the Corn Belt of 200 pounds of DAP per acre entails 40.5 pounds of P per acre, not P2O5, but actual elemental P, this means that to be a hotspot of P loss is equivalent in magnitude to losing less than 5% of your DAP application. Why do I bring this up? Well, let's go back to PUE. Assuming that you hit 95% P use efficiency of your DAP or your MAP or your manure application, that 5% not being used by the crop leaves the door open to still constitute a hotspot. Now recall that most of the US is 30 to 40% PUE. The world average is 16%. We're already at 80% in this part of the world. So that target that might be aspirational of 95% is really difficult to do. And secondly, we can be the best in the world, 95% PUE, and that still leaves room for P losses that are appreciable for water quality. So basically, a large magnitude for water quality impacts is not a large magnitude for PUE. This is the apparent paradox. Now, what I just showed you is an assessment of P loss net at the watershed or at the county, but the question might remain, the how much we're losing per acre as an average is agnostic to and does not tell us about the where is it coming from. So I want to lay some background before we talk about streambank erosion. This is critical to getting the why does it matter. We can measure non-point and point sources, and by definition, a point source can be quantified. Think of a pipe of effluent like an ethanol plant, a factory, a wastewater treatment plant. And by law, these different institutes have to keep permits on, or records and permits, on their discharge. And we know the total amount that exits a state. So take, for example, where I live now in Illinois, we know that, or we have an estimate, I should say, of how much total phosphorus exits the states using USGS gauges. And these gauges, based upon the inference space of the drained cropland or just total land, we can know pretty well total P loss from a state. We know the point sources, like Chicago, within the state. And then we subtract the point from the total, and by difference, we get the non-point. So what this means is that we are estimating non-point sources by difference between the measured total loss of the state from the point sources, which are individual facilities that keep records on. So by definition, you can't measure a non-point source directly. The problem is when you have states like Illinois that have a figure like this in our nutrient loss reduction strategy, in which they distinguish point sources in red, urban runoff in blue, but then they have in green agricultural losses of phosphorus. And this is wrong. This is a non-point source. Based on the math, you're getting at non-point source. Because agriculture is one of several non-point sources, we can't simply equate or make synonymous non-point source with agriculture. Currently, we are doing that in most of the Mississippi River Basin states, which means that we are incorrectly overestimating the contribution of agriculture to P losses. One key non-point, non-ag source is this, streambank erosion. This is me in the forefront, and against the bluff that is being sloughed off by the small creek in the foreground is a good example of streambank erosion. This is about a 30-foot tall bluff. What you see here is the subsoil. This is the loess that was blown in that makes our states the most fertile soil type-wise in the entire US and in the world. It's why we have the highest yields of soybean and corn in the globe. So streambank erosion is a natural process. Humans can aggravate the rate like erosion, but the basic idea is that streams and water try to find the lowest point of the landscape. So if you have a flatter landscape, there's more snaking back and forth as the water tries to find the low point. This is called meandering. And as you meander, you slough off the channels as you try to find a new route as a stream. So you get more meandering and thus more bank erosion, typically in flatter landscapes like in the Midwest. And this is a gradual process where you eat away and you undercut the bank. And then if that undercut gets severe enough, there's sudden loss of the bank structure. It's called mass failure, and all this sediment soil falls into the bank. So this process happens naturally. Humans can change it by altering the hydrology of a watershed. The point, though, is that there's hot moments where all of a sudden you lose a lot of sediment from that gradual undercutting, manifesting in a sudden mass failure event. And you're loading what is a soil, streambank soil, as sediments now. And as you probably know, most of our phosphorus loading is via sediments because phosphorus, unlike nitrate, sticks to clay and silt-sized particles, metaphorically speaking. And as a result, if you've got high sediment loading, you've got high phosphorus loading. Now, this happens at very long timescales, which necessitates assessments of streambank erosion that are not simply 5 years, but decadal in nature. One way to do this is by remote analysis or image analysis from airplanes as far back as the 1930s. And we can look at, in this example, from central Illinois, the Margenot as it meanders, as it snakes across this flat landscape. We can see that the channel position has been altered. So there is redeposition in tandem with the sloughing off. So the streambank erosion is not a net loading, it is a gross loading. The net loading would be the deposition subtracted from the initial sloughing off. The point, though, is that the best that we can do to get at these long timescales is the gross loading of sediments by tracking them meandering back and forth across this landscape. Now let's talk about the magnitudes. Do we care about how much phosphorus, or should we care about how much phosphorus is being loaded? So taking some nice examples from Iowa's survey, we have here basically, we can calculate how much sediment is being loaded. You measure how long the bank is, the recession rate, which is how far in is it being sloughed off over a given unit of time, the height. Now you've got 3 dimensions, which with the density gives you, with the concentration of phosphorus, that we can measure a sense of how much P is being loaded. So using some rough numbers here, these are largely assumptions to illustrate the magnitudes. Across a state like Illinois, we're losing a lot of sediment, 16 million tons of sediment per year. And that's about 7.6 thousand tons of phosphorus, short tons. Now, to put that into context, that's 17 million pounds of phosphorus. That is exactly what our state has to reduce our phosphorus losses by the year of 2045, the ultimate US EPA drawdown target. So I'm not saying that we can stop all bank erosion because it's a natural process, but rather that the magnitude of phosphorus being loaded or encumbered by this process is not trivial. It's quite a bit of phosphorus that's entering into the waterways. Now, another reason why we should care about this is not the how much, but it's the how long for that phosphorus that's entering into the waterway to exit the system. This is important because there's a thing called lag times of legacy nutrient loading, and I'll talk about that shortly. But basically, imagine that you erode a stream bank soil. Like any soil, the kinds, the flavors of phosphorus present are very different. We call this speciation, different species. And as you can see here, what we measure by a soil test for crop production, like bray or melic, is going to be this red sliver. Typically, no more than 5%, and typically less than that, of the total phosphorus in a soil or a stream bank soil is in this form. That will be rapidly solubilized and will be detected downstream as dissolved reactive phosphorus, DRP. But there's other forms of phosphorus that are slow release for different reasons and at different time scales. So when we erode a stream bank into the stream, there's this immediate pulse of DRP, but then the majority of the phosphorus might take on the order of years, decades, and even centuries. Some studies suggest even centuries to leave the water system. This then is why stream bank erosion matters. It builds the basis for lag times and thus a legacy of continued phosphorus losses downstream from a past erosional event. And that makes it very tricky to quantify and to achieve targeted reductions in certain timelines. Now, this might explain why in Illinois, and I'm sure in Iowa as well, why we see sometimes nonsensical, unexplained changes in P losses. Again, the sediments that we lose by bank erosion can take a long time to exit the stream, so they might keep on giving phosphorus downstream for quite some time. Here's an example of why this might be useful to explain what we are seeing today. So we know that in the state of Illinois, as a 5-year average from 2019 to 2024, this was published last fall, 2023, that as a 5-year average, we saw a 35% increase in P losses. So we have a third more P losses driven by the non-point source sector. However, we know for certain that that farmland in the state of Illinois has been underapplying phosphorus, meaning we're in a negative balance, meaning farmers are applying less phosphorus than what is being taken off of fields with the harvest of grain. There's more phosphorus flowing out with grain harvest than going on as fertilizer or as manure. So if we're in a negative balance, the unexplained increase in phosphorus losses as a 5-year average cannot be due to over-fertilization. It just doesn't work out on a mass balance basis. So the question has been asked in our state for the past year and a half quite intensely, where the heck is this phosphorus coming from? And one potential source could be these legacy sediments that are entrained and are inside of the channels of rivers and streams, largely from bank erosion. So this is an example of why there's immediate implications for understanding why are we seeing changes in our P loads as a state. So the question might be asked, okay, Andrew, you've been yapping about the MRB, bank erosion, phosphorus loads. What do we know about phosphorus contributions from bank erosion in the MRB across all 31 states that drain into the largest watershed of North America? The answer would be, we have no idea. So there's no official documentation. Iowa comes closest. So Iowa at least has a working number. But let's break this down first. There are 31 states in the MRB shown here. And we went to the 12 states that have an official nutrient loss reduction plan or strategy, NLRS. These 12 states, which include the major corn producing states like our 2 states, have a plan that follows on the EPA memo to get it together and figure out how to reduce these losses. So we combed through all of the state plans, and we also looked at the updates. What we found was that in all of the state plans that put forward a way to assess where is the P coming from and how to better decrease those losses, that no states explicitly have a number on bank erosion contributions to P losses. Some states don't even say the words, like these states. They don't even acknowledge that this is a process that is part of their phosphorus loss budgets. And some states, like Illinois, do recognize it, but they point out that we just don't have any numbers on it. Same for Iowa. We know that it's a big proportion of your P losses, but there's no hard data in the official plan from 2012 or 2015 for our 2 states that says this is how much is being loaded. So if we think about this more specifically, of the 31 states in the MRB, only 6 states acknowledge that bank erosion matters as a source of P losses. And only 6 of those states also talk about, and only 5 states talk about whether we can manage bank erosion by armoring or shielding of banks or doing wetlands as a way to break down the speed of the stream and thus the erosional effect. So it's at least acknowledged by some states, including Iowa. Now, Iowa, though it's not in its original plan in the NRS of Iowa, it is the only state that you have figured out how much phosphorus roughly is coming from bank erosion. This is work done by Dr. Keith Schilling, and he determined with his team that roughly 31% of the total P export, which would be roughly 39% of the non-point source, in magnitude is coming from bank erosion as an 18-year average. So kudos to Iowa for being the first state in this field of research to get a number that's a statewide assessment. All the other states, though, we have no idea. We just have no data. Okay, so we also looked at the updates to the state plans. Perhaps in the last 10 years that have elapsed since those state plans, there's been updates. And it's encouraging to see that some states, like the ones shown here, have at least now begun to attempt estimates of how much bank erosion is occurring and the P loads engendered by that. And there's now, however, the same number of states. There's only still 5 states talking about how we might be able to manage bank erosion as a way to decrease our non-point P losses. Now, we published this in the Journal of Environmental Quality. This is an effort that I want to point out was involving multiple states, both researchers shown here in red and also people who are policymakers or policy adjacent or from commodity groups. I think it's a good example of how it will take different scientific domains, hydrology, soil science, agronomy, and different spheres from policymaking to commodity boards to researchers to work together to tackle this problem, not unlike nutrient loss reductions in general. And we even made the cover, as you can see here. So we're quite proud of this because this work, thanks to USB and NCGA funding and NREC as well, helped put this issue on the map. It has been done for some time. A big credit goes to Dr. Keith Schilling for instigating this work in Iowa 20 years ago. And so we're building on his shoulders to put forth to policymakers, you can't ignore this, and we have to understand this process as a source of non-point P. So I want to now give a few final quantitative feel and values for P erosion. So we did a global meta-analysis, meaning across all published studies anywhere in the world, what's the sense that researchers have on the contribution of streambank erosion to sediment and to P losses? And as we can see here, for sediments, on average, as the median, which is, I think, a more accurate measure of an average, roughly a third of the total sediment loads in global watersheds is thought to be coming from bank erosion. It's not nothing. The other 2/3 would be from overland erosion from, say, fields. And roughly as well, 30% of our total phosphorus export, so what's being loaded, is coming from bank erosion. These numbers agree because, as I mentioned, the fate of phosphorus is typically tied to the fate of sediments, unlike nitrate. Now, we then did a separate meta-analysis where we combed through all peer-reviewed scientific studies and we aggregate those results. We did one specific to the MRB region. And what you're seeing here in this map is the distribution of where these studies were done across 51 publications in the past 50 years. And as we can see, there's been a good amount of work in Iowa, in Minnesota, really the central to western Corn Belt. But the Eastern Corn Belt, including Illinois, has quite a large void. There's not much research on this. So that's the important caveat to what you're about to hear as a result. We find that overall, these are short-term studies. Recall that because of the decadal nature of bank erosion, we would prefer to have multiple decades of assessments through things like remote sensing. And overall, the average phosphorus loading across these studies in the central to western Corn Belt, and thus the central to western MRB, on average, bank erosion is loading 0.7 pounds of P per acre. Now, as a percent of the total P load, that's as low as 2% to as high as 44% of the phosphorus in a watershed is coming from bank erosion. So there's quite a range of that. That's the percent contribution. That absolute value is 0.7 pounds as an average, which, by the way, is exactly what the entire MRB is losing. Clearly, I'm not implying that all of our P losses across the MRB are from bank erosion because we don't have coverage of the MRB in entire regions, right? The eastern and the very far west portion. But again, it goes back to this theme that streambank erosion is an appreciable source of P loading. Okay, so what are the consequences of not accounting for bank erosion as a non-point, non-ag source of phosphorus losses, which we've now confirmed through a few studies? There's 4 consequences. One is we're overestimating how much agriculture is contributing. And this, I think, is inaccurate and for policy unfair. Agriculture is not loading the P from streambank to the extent that streambank erosion is not from agriculture. And we can talk about that in the Q&A shortly. Second is that we're missing a chance to manage a potentially reducible source of non-point P losses. There are ways to potentially decrease bank erosion or the legacy sediments. And as a result of this, we might be misdirecting resources. So to the extent that a certain amount of phosphorus is coming from banks and not from fields, investments financially in the fields to reduce P losses won't really translate to much outcome. And finally, and this is, I think, the most important reason or implication of this work, is that expectations by the public and by policymakers may not be realistic. Because of these lag times or the sediments that are loaded by bank erosion, we can be looking at, as others have found, up to 1,000-year lag time for the phosphorus that was loaded by bank erosion to leave and exit the system. This is critical because it means that certain targets, like the reduction of phosphorus by 45% by the year 2045, that may not happen until 2145 or even 2200, if we're being very conservative here based upon these predictions of the lag times. Okay, you might be asking, why are these erosion contributions, or sorry, why are the stream bank erosion contributions of phosphorus missing? This seems obvious, Andrew. Why did this not happen? And I want to emphasize that it's very difficult to produce this data, both because someone had to have the good sense to begin this process 20 years ago, like Iowa has done. And also, even with this process of beginning to collect data at decadal timescales, it's not easy. So, for example, Illinois does point out that there's just no data on this process, even though, to their credit, they acknowledge that it is important. To give you a feel of what needs to be done, what states are beginning to do here in Illinois is what we're doing, and we're really following again in the footsteps of Iowa researchers, is coupling multiple methods that give us different spatial and temporal scales of assessment of erosion rates of stream banks, and then the phosphorus loading as well as the nitrate that is also loaded by the erosion of banks. This is not cheap. We're talking 7 to 8 figures to do this over a few years with a decent amount of basic confidence at a state scale. So it's not cheap, but the data is invaluable. So to summarize this, we know that stream bank erosion is important to quantify because it is one of the non-point sources of P loading to surface waters that Iowa, Illinois, and other states in the MRB had been asked by the federal EPA to decrease. And also, we care in our states because it's important for local water quality, not just the Gulf of Mexico. It's equally important. However, the contribution of stream bank erosion to this non-point P source is unclear. It's not been well quantified. It's not acknowledged in most state plans. It's not quantified in any of the state plans. Again, Iowa now has the data from Dr. Schilling's efforts to enable that. And we've not quantified in any state or really anywhere in the world the lag times. We have estimates from Europe, from the Baltic Sea Basin, which is the world's largest hypoxic zone, by the way. They have estimates of lag times that might be centennial, so centuries, to millennial in the worst case. So needs and next steps. There needs to be a push in the research to go beyond the mass balance, inputs and outputs, like what we do for PU's efficiency, and understand within the watershed what's going on. What are the mechanisms of P loading and lag times of stream bank erosion? And we must quantify how much, the type of phosphorus, and then how long it might take. This will then let us address the 4 gaps, the 4 consequences listed here of stream bank erosion for phosphorus non-point P loads. And ultimately, I think, and this is being done now, there's a need to tackle this through integrating disciplines. Soil science, that's why I'm talking to you about stream bank erosion, with hydrology and biogeochemistry. So with that, I'd like to conclude the presentation. I know we have time for questions and a few more slides by Dr. Helmers. So thanks for your time. I look forward to the Q&A.
Thank you, Andrew. Great talk, and get the questions in. We've gotten many, and this will be great discussion, I think. So if you're on today and need to earn a CCA CEU, please send to Alena Whitaker, ALENAW @iastate.edu. Again, ALENAW @iastate.edu. Your name, the name you entered to watch the webinar, and your CCA number, and send that by 5 o'clock today. We can go to the next slide. It should be, if you watch this webinar live and have not already filled out the voluntary demographic survey for a 2024 webinar, if you would, we'd greatly appreciate it. You can go to iowalearningfarms.org/survey or scan that QR code. So we greatly appreciate it if you've done one in 2024. Thank you. All right, next slide. We'll put a plug in for the webinar next week. Dr. Robin Wilson will be talking to us, a social scientist from the Ohio State University. It pains me to say "the" there, but she's a professor of risk analysis and decision science, talking about motivational barriers to implementing conservation. And then a plug, all the webinars are archived on the Iowa Learning Farms website or on YouTube. So, all right. We got some questions in here, and maybe one of the first ones kind of getting at this linking of hydrology in this. If question was, if altered hydrology and increased runoff due to land use changes are a primary driver of stream bank erosion and largely driven by some of our land use changes in agriculture over the years, is it useful to separate stream bank erosion as a non-ag, non-point source?
That's a good question. So just for me to rephrase, to make sure that I'm following, I think the premise here is that if we've modified hydrology of a landscape from ag practices, ag land use, like tiling, for example, then the effects that might exacerbate stream power or stream dynamics that would lead to more bank erosion, then in some sense, ag is in fact partly responsible for this. And that's a very good point. The short answer is that yes, that can happen. And it's very difficult to quantify that. So I'll stick to tile drainage. We have a separate study, a meta-analysis with NCGA funding, where we have found that it depends. There are some watersheds that we found where the stream flashiness, which we presume would lead to more bank erosion, is either exacerbated by tiling. As you get more tiling in the watershed, we see more stream flashiness, which we would think would lead to more bank erosion. But there's also watersheds where tiling decreases stream flashiness. And it has to do with the interplay of surface runoff versus subsurface drainage. And what we find, and this has been found by others, is that when you've got low infiltration soils, think of heavy clay, tiling decreases their runoff because you improve the infiltration into the profile. And in those systems, there's net decrease in stream flashiness because the flashiness was being driven by the runoff. If you've got, say, well-infiltrating soils, we find the opposite, that tiling in those contexts can exacerbate the flashiness. So there's a role for tile drainage to help mitigate bank erosion, and it's places where we should think about, can we manage how we tile drain, control structures, wetland buffers at the receiving end to mitigate the flashiness impact.
All right. The next question we have here. You talked a little bit about this, but can you maybe expound on the implications of some of this on the nitrogen side?
Yeah, that's a fantastic point. So I showed you a meta-analysis that we did for the MRB of what's been done on bank erosion, and we found only one study from Missouri that looked at the amount of nitrogen being loaded with bank erosion. We know that our soils have high levels of nitrogen from organic matter. The flat and black of Illinois into Iowa, these are mollisols. They're rich in organic matter. We're talking tens of thousands of pounds of total N to 3-foot depth, largely though in the top foot or two where it's the dark color. And so if you're eroding a stream bank soil, you would imagine that that's a good amount of nitrogen. Now it's largely in organic form. It has to be hydrolyzed, mineralized into ammonium, which then has to oxidize to nitrate. So it stands to reason that there's probably some contribution of nitrate from bank erosion through the organic N contained in the surface soil. However, there's no data except for one study in Missouri, and I believe it was on the order of 10% of the watershed N was thought to be loaded by bank erosion. This question is what we're trying to attempt to answer through a current project with Iowa State, with Dr. Bill Crumpton and myself. I believe that Dr. Helmers is part of that as well. With Commodity Board funding. So we're trying to, for our two states, understand the comprehensive loading, not just of P, but also of N from this process.
Okay, thanks.
I will say, though, one last comment, that I do think that the relative contribution of nutrients will probably be greater for P than for N for bank erosion.
How can we account for the bank erosion contributions on an annual P load? How long do those bank sediments reside and maybe how much is stored in the channel?
That's a great question
Yeah.
from Dr. Schilling, I see.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I think that's the holy grail of research right now on this topic. I mentioned and I showed that figure of the uh, example lag times that was not to scale of different phosphorus forms. To me, that's a really important next step. And that might begin with lab-based experiments, incubations to mimic different different oxic to anoxic conditions of the sediments in the channel to begin to understand what are the release rates of organic P, of iron-bound P, etc., upon the erosion. I think broadly speaking, we're going to have some kinds of P that will mineralize or reductively solubilize, like FeP, upon erosion at different time scales. But then some forms like apatitic phosphorus, which is a huge source of P from our lusts, that might take a long time to dissolve, or it may just tumble down with the fines, or it might be exported as the fines. So there's a lot of sedimentology research that we have to couple with biogeochemistry and frankly a bit of modeling to begin to constrain those lag times. The other major factor, I think, is redeposition of sediments downstream on a floodplain. So I think of this as bank erosion introduces phosphorus through sediments, but then it kind of hopscotches or leapfrogs its way down the channel. And we might be eroding what was actually eroded deposition from further upstream. Those dynamics, I think, need to be quantified to get at the proper estimates. For the annual loading part of your question, I don't think we're there yet, and it might take a long time to get there.
Okay. Another one, how did the P get into the stream banks?
Great question. So, the majority of it, I believe, is going to be native. So we call this naturally occurring phosphorus. To step back here, our soils across this part of the Midwest are derived from loess, a fine, salty material called aeolian that was blown in post-glaciation. And the loess that we have is unique in two ways. One is that it's rich in calcium carbonates relative to other loess parts of the world, like the loess plateau of China or Ukraine. And our loess is also pretty high in phosphorus. And the main mineral form of phosphorus that's native from rocks, as rocks decompose, it gives off soil, is apatite. Apatite is calcium phosphate. It's what your teeth and bones are made out of. So if we look at how much phosphorus, pound per acre, total amount, is in a 5-foot profile, we've quantified this for Illinois, likely for Iowa, to be from 15,000 to 25,000 pounds of P per acre in the top 5 foot. And if you think about how much fertilizer is going on, in the top 6 inches, I think a lot of the P there would be from fertilizer. But as a percent, of the total phosphorus, not that much. So for example, we've quantified leftover fertilizer in Illinois, and the estimates are about 5 billion pounds of P. Well, that's only 5% of the total P stock that's already there in soils. So the fertilizer contribution matters because it's more susceptible to loss as DRP. And if we erode the surface from a field, it's very important. But for the entire profile to be sloughed off with bank erosion, mass failure, the majority of that is going to be native phosphorus, not fertilizer, even if you're farming up until the stream bank, which is probably not a great practice that we should stop.
You kind of touched on this on managing it. What practices do you see as the most promising for reducing stream bank erosion?
Yeah, I think we might think of this direct and indirect. So directly, there's been lots of stream bank shielding or stabilization programs, and these take forms of directly armoring the stream bank with riprap, concrete slabs, rocks, even the hulls of old cars back in the 60s. And then also putting structures in the stream itself that help halt or decrease the kinetic energy of the water, almost like a buoy system for a dock or a port. So these were used and they are used. Many states have some programs. I'll say it's very expensive and the armoring is not exactly neutral ecologically. So it costs a lot of money to put concrete slabs, excuse me, to steel, so to speak, the stream bank against the kinetic impact of the stream. The other thing is that we don't have great data on the outcomes. So, for example, in Illinois, we don't have a shred of data that follows up after 5, 10, 20 years on, for all that money on the program to stabilize stream banks, what did it do for the net reductions? And I think that's an area where our two states are well poised, given our program's history, to do follow-ups to quantify that. So that's the direct, right? Is you stop the bank itself from eroding. The indirect is to deal with the fallout, with the sediments in the channel. And so Wisconsin here in Dane County, they have been dredging streams to get the sediments out. Now, these sediments are a mix of bank erosion and overfield erosion. And the idea is that Wisconsin did the math and figured it was cheaper per pound of pee taken out of the system to just dredge these critical small streams that feed into their lakes, like Lake Mendota. And the net outcome was better just to dredge. So you can also dredge, which I understand is also not exactly cheap and ecologically not great for aquatic ecosystems. Those are the two best approaches that I think the data points towards.
So I think that your first one there, thinking about, kind of stabilizing those streams. I come from a civil engineering background, so the hard engineering there, I'm like a recovering civil engineer, but with some of the questions we've had too, I think that would be an area of research of what's the outcomes from that, because even if we armor that one area, are we just transitioning the problem downstream? So yeah, I think a very important area of research, what's the outcomes from some of these practices?
Agreed. And if I could add one more comment now, channelized ditches might be a thing for us to reconsider. There's different ditch designs, like 2 stages with a bench, so to speak, but also just south of the research farms on campus, there's a ditch that was re-channelized, and it's a straight ditch for 2 miles. And because it's so straight, the water picks up velocity. And I think we should really re-envision how we do drainage ditches. They're essential to drain our croplands. Drainage is a good thing for crop production and N2O emission reductions. We want to drain our croplands. But we should think about how to export that water in a way that I think is probably more intelligent. A straight ditch that goes for 2 miles, picks up velocity, and sloughs off the ditch edge is, I don't think, the best approach. So I think that would be another thing to consider. I know it's complicated because it involves work with the Army Corps of Engineers sometimes and drainage districts, but I think that's an overlooked way to decrease on not really a stream, I guess in some sense. And Matt, this is for you. It's maybe philosophical. Is a ditch a stream? But the point is, it is a waterway sloughing off a lot of sediment.
Yeah, that kind of gets at one of the questions here is discussing differences in stream bank P loads between channelized and more meandered streams. Yep. All right, let's see here. Okay, I guess there is, one thing could, some of increasing water retention on the landscape, how might that, potentially decrease some of that stream power, and would that be an area that could be of importance?
From what I've seen, the data suggests that that's a great way to do this. I think a link that we're assuming to be true is a linear relationship between stream power and bank erosion. And I think that's not linear. It's not step by step, tit for tat. But there's definitely a positive qualitative relationship. If there's more stream power because there's more volume after a rain event, more flashiness, increasing the retention before the water exits into the stream is a great idea. That's why tile drains can decrease stream flashiness in some contexts and also increase it in others. So I think efforts that would be focused on retarding the entry of water is a great idea. Different ways to do that. Drain control structures, for example, wetlands that are constructed as a way to buffer the kinetic energy, having ditches that are designed to not be straight shots for miles. These are all ways that we can increase, well, that one is not. But there are ways to increase the retention within the soil profile to then decrease the flashiness. I would suggest, though, that we should really look at the nature of the relationship of the stream flashiness with bank erosion. That will probably vary by soil properties, like sandiness, and by the base flow for that watershed as well.
Yeah. Okay, great. There was somebody commenting about the opportunities for reconnecting streams to their floodplains to restore some of the stable form to stable channel there. Yeah, go ahead.
I think that's a good point. Sediments are supposed to flux across these landscapes, and they iteratively deposit, remobilize, deposit, etc. It comes down to how much, right? It's not that it happens, it's how much happens. I think floodplains are like wetlands. They can be sourced to sinks, and they can switch back and forth. So they're not a solution in my mind to decreasing P loads. They can, in some contexts, like a newly constructed wetland, be a net sink, but then they can also switch to a source. And that's the hypothesis for why we're seeing a huge jump in P losses as a 5-year average for Illinois, is that there's a lot of remobilization of floodplain deposition in the last 5 years.
Okay. There was one here. This might be a question to get Andrew Rupiper back on. Beaver have moved into the Headland Creek on one of their farms. Would this be a positive for P mitigation?
That's a great question. I would throw into the mix mill ponds. I'm from the Northeast, and mills, ponds are everywhere. And then also reservoirs from damming up streams and rivers to provide drinking water supplies. In all these examples, I think we had this initial net sink for P. So you have a physical place to store the sediments that settle out, be it a mill pond, a beaver dam, a reservoir, so human or beaver. And then after a while, as you silt up the reservoir capacity, be it a wetland to the beaver pond, etc., you then get, well, two things. There's now fines that can escape, but also you get reductive dissolution. The iron-bound phosphorus under layering becomes anoxic, lacks of oxygen, and that can then solubilize out the phosphorus. So there's pretty good evidence that was recently published that in the case of wetlands that are constructed to mitigate P losses for the first, part of their life, and how long varies on how big in the load. But there's a point where they saturate. They just can't hold any more sediment, and then they begin to be a net source. So as a temporary bandage, I think it works great. As a solution, I don't think it will solve long-term P losses.
Okay. I think here's one that I think is important based on what we've seen in some of our rainfall patterns here in Iowa this year. But can you expand on the climate variability impact on stream banks, such as wet years with sustained high flows and channels that could increase that bank erosion or mass wasting?
Yeah, that's a very important point. Is we know that increasing variation in climate is going to entail more frequent and more violent rain events, where we get 2 inches in an hour and a half or something crazy. We've not caught it as bad as you have in Iowa over the past few weeks, but some of the numbers that I'm seeing from Minnesota and Iowa in terms of how much it's fallen is a prime example of how it's the intensity of the precipitation, how much and what time frame, that intensity increasing, which will likely just keep on increasing in the coming decades. That's not great news for bank erosion, because we'll have more flashiness. There's just too much water in too little time to process. It can't be retained or retarded through the profile. It's just going to run off or flush out through tiles. And in those cases, we would anticipate more stream flashiness, more stream power, more bank erosion. This is where we get into thresholds. Are there certain thresholds where no matter what we do on the landscape, from field to in-channel practices, there's a certain amount of precip influx that will just blow out the best practices. And these thresholds, I think, are important to keep in mind, perhaps to quantify, because they give us kind of points of no return for expecting a lot of sediment losses that are beyond our control.
Okay. Maybe just one last one in the interest of time, and it kind of follows up on the question of thinking about some of the sources and sinks that you commented on. I think important, but this individual asked, you've been discussing how impoundments could act as both source and sinks, but could they also help attenuate peak flows and reduce that stream flashiness that might help with some of the downstream, even if it's not retaining P in the impoundment itself, if it's helping reduce some of the flashiness, it still might be better.
Absolutely. I think that's a very important point is that just like cover crops, right, there are multiple outcomes of interest and they may not be aligned sometimes. And so impoundments, reservoirs, whatever, beaver dam ponds, they all have the benefit of at least trying to slow down the kinetic energy of effluent from fields. And so that would still be a benefit independent of whether there's now net saturation of sediment in that retention pond or impoundment and thus a switch to source.
Yeah. All right, Andrew, thank you so much. I apologize to some that we didn't get to some of the questions there, but want to be respectful of Andrew's time and others that are on as well. I think if nothing else, we learned this is an important topic and one that there's a lot of interest in. So it may be something that we try to have some other presentations on in the future as well. Again, if you need a CCA CEU, please email Elena Whitaker at alenaw@iastate.edu by 5 o'clock today with your name, the name you entered to watch their webinar, and your CCA number. And please consider tuning in next week at noon for Dr. Robin Wilson from The Ohio State University. With that, Andrew, I'll give you the last word. I want to thank you very much for participating today and the research you're doing on this important topic.
Thank you, Matt. I appreciate the invitation. I'm looking forward to working with folks like Dr. Crumpton and Dr. Schilling and yourself on these topics across our two states.
All right. Thanks very much.